Hi, welcome to World Civilizations up to 1500. Now, we're starting the fourth topic of the semester titled India in Search of Divine Reality. Now, this is the first session of this fourth topic, and we're going to now initiate this topic with presenting the table of contents just to understand how we're going to approach this topic. But before we move into the table of contents, let me first here introduce the second part of the course, which is going to deal with three more topics, the fourth, fifth, and sixth, which are going to deal with civilizations that in many cases started out very early on in the ancient world at the time of the river civilizations, for example, 3000 BC or thereabouts, but had the longest historical continuity that went far beyond the initial river civilizations we examined in the first part of the semester, Mesopotamia and Egypt. The civilizations that we're going to explore here, starting with India and the fourth topic, and then the fifth topic will be devoted to China, and then the sixth topic will be devoted to the Mesoamerican civilizations. We're going to be looking at the Olmec, Toltec, and Maya. In many regards, those civilizations started out almost at the same time as the other river civilizations we examined in the past, but had, for various reasons that we're going to be exploring in this second part of the course, they had, again, a continuity that transcended, in many cases, many disruptions and interruptions, and many of the initial cultural ideas that were founded in their inception were maintained and carried on and modified to a certain degree over time, but many of those cultural features and elements were maintained. So those civilizations, again, are going to continue all the way to the time that we're going to be looking at in this course, up to 1500 AD. Still, by 1500 AD, the Indian civilization, the Chinese, and to a certain degree, the Mesoamerican civilizations were, again, still very much present up to 1500. Of course, now after 1500, there will be significant changes that will transpire, of course, and will affect the development and the character of those civilizations. This is something that, of course, has to be explored in the second part of this course in World Civ 2, which starts from 1500 AD to the present. So those are millenarian civilizations. Millenarian civilizations, they have spanned for thousands of years. They have continued their intrinsic characteristics with change, but nonetheless, again, they were maintained over long periods of time. So we start with India. And the subtitle of this civilization has been termed In Search of Divine Reality. Okay? And I will explain in more detail why this is so, but at this point, it is worth mentioning that one of the central ideas of Indian civilization is the idea that what is real, what is reality, in other words, what is really permanent and eternal is not really of this world. It is really a divine realm, if you will, that encompasses everything, of course, including this world, but it also transcends this world altogether. So again, this is going to be the central idea of Indian civilization that really lasted for thousands of years, all the way to 15 AD, and really and beyond as well. Okay, I will explain more in depth again what that concept actually means. There will be a philosophical elaboration again of what divine reality actually implies. But again, this is going to be the central characteristic, the heart and soul of Indian civilization. All right, so this is a millenarian civilization that has gone through significant stages of development, so to speak, and different eras and periods of time that each one has shaped the course of Indian history and Indian culture. And we're going to be exploring precisely those time periods, which are considered one of the most important time periods in Indian civilization. They're divided into four major parts. The first part, we're going to look at the Indus River Civilization. This is really the inception of Indian civilization back when Mesopotamia, for example, and Egypt were emerging again as well, around 3000 BC, thereabout, again, the river civilizations. So we're going to see the rise of another river civilization, but in northwestern India, and scholars do not know the term or the name of that civilization, how they call themselves, but it was called, again, for academic purposes, the Indus River Civilization. We're going to have to see that. And then there's going to be, in part two, another time period in which India is going to receive a wave of nomadic groups. We talked about those nomadic groups in the third topic of the semester, the Indo-Europeans. We talked about the Indo-Europeans migrating out of the Caucasus Mountains to different areas of the world. Well, one group known as the Aryans are going to go to India. They're going to be moving into India, and they're going to start a new period of Indian history known as the Vedic Age or the Vedic period. Okay, so we're going to examine that as well. This is, again, a very, very important development that really transformed Indian society and Indian culture in very profound ways. Then we're going to look at, in part three, another time period that saw like a kind of renaissance, a spiritual, intellectual renaissance in India. It was really a very large time period that spanned, roughly speaking, again, those are really estimates, from 700 BC all the way to 700 AD. So again, we're talking about 1500 year period, again, more or less. And this is termed the classical age of India, Indians' classical age, the golden age. And we're going to get to see why. Again, there's going to be, of course, proliferation of writings about spiritual matters, spiritual literature, spiritual disciplines and schools are going to flourish across India, and this again is going to give India its classical character. So we're going to get to see that as well very closely. Okay, this is when again the schools of yoga, Vedanta, Jainism, Buddhism flourish during this time. So we're going to get to explore each one of those schools and mystery movements, if you will, really trying to explore the mysteries of life, the mysteries of human existence, the universe, and trying to get in touch with this divine reality. Once again, this is the main concern of Indian culture, divine reality. Now, the final part, part 4, is going to look at another very important stage of development of Indian history, which really also transformed Indian political systems, Indian society, and the like. in very profound ways, and that is when India entered what is called the Age of Empires. There will be, very briefly, at the very beginning, a series of empires that flourished. They're not going to last very long, but again, there was an attempt to unify India under a single imperial system. We're going to get to see those imperial systems, the dynasties in this case, that try to bring together all the different parts of India under one political order. The Mauryan, for example, dynasty, the Mauryan Empire will be assessed, which was really the very first empire in India. Then after that, we're going to look at the Gupta Empire, and which also lasted for a brief period of time as well. And then at the end, we're going to look at the Mughal Empire. And this is going to be an empire that is going to take us to the very last period of this course, from the 10th century thereabouts all the way to the 16th century, okay, the 1500s thereabouts again. So we're going to look at Indian civilization from its very inception back in 3000 BC all the way to 1500 AD, okay? And those are the four main stages of development, time periods that are important for understanding Indian civilization up to 1500 AD. All right. So once again, as a general introduction, India, as well as China, for example, that we're going to get to see in the fifth topic, and also Mesoamerica, those are millenarian civilizations. They have lasted for thousands of years. Unlike other civilizations, for example, when we look at Egypt, we looked at how Egypt suffered major interruptions, particularly as we approach, let us just say, the year 1000 BC, after the end of the New Kingdom, for example. Egypt entered into a decline. This civilization had lasted for thousands of years, had a long continuity, but after 1000 BC, Egypt began to be really now invaded constantly from the outside and overtaken by other groups, ruled by foreign powers. And we see now the decline of Egyptian civilization didn't really last much. We see also in Mesopotamia the rise and fall of empires. And again, by the end of the 4th century, more or less BC, we see the end of the Persian Empire, which was the last of a series of empires. And with that, again, Mesopotamian civilization also entered a kind of decline as well. You can also look at, for example, at the Greeks and the Romans. They also forged, of course, empires that lasted centuries, but ultimately those empires collapsed and their civilizations entered into dark ages, so to speak. There were major disruptions, and there were very few elements that actually survived from those civilizations. So in India, as well as in China, in Mesoamerica, again, we're going to see a long continuity, again, of cultural ideas, cultural norms, philosophies, for example, that persisted despite interruptions, despite invasions from nomads, despite political changes, despite empires and the like. Again, their intrinsic characteristics remain pretty much, okay, across thousands of years. Now, as I explained at the very outset, again, of this video, the subtitle of this topic that deals with Indus civilization is In Search of Divine Reality. And the reason why we're approaching Indus civilization from this perspective, why we characterize Indian civilization as a civilization that is in search for this divine reality, is because that is precisely what sets Indian civilization apart from all the other civilizations of the world. Remember, when we talk about Egypt, the main premise was balance and harmony. That was really the main principle, the main idea guiding Egyptian civilization. People really perceived a world in which there was perfect balance and harmony in nature, the environment, the perfect rhythms of the sun and agriculture and the like. Again, and the Nile, the ebb and flow of the Nile, very predictable. Again, it really, informed Egyptian politics, Egyptian religion, Egyptian mythology. Everything that we really study about Egyptian civilization derives from this very fundamental notion, balance and harmony, whereas in Mesopotamia, the idea was order out of chaos, because the environment was very chaotic. People were trying to find order in the world, and they were devising mythologies, they were devising religions, and they were coming up with scientific systems like astronomy in order to find that order. There was a search for order because they really couldn't fathom the idea of living in a very uncertain, insecure, violent, chaotic world. Here in India, the idea that is really central to people's conception of life, conception of the universe, is the idea that reality, what we call reality, what is really real, in other words, is not of this world. Okay? It's not of this physical, material, natural world. It is in another realm. Again, it is divine, and that is really what is real. That is really what is permanent and eternal. So the idea of trying to really create in this world systems that will be everlasting and permanent, again, is really not part of Indian consciousness. Okay, it's not part of their goal in life. Okay, this is not what they actually pursue, because they actually ultimately believe that this world is really an illusion. Okay, this physical, material, natural world is really an illusion. So when you look at, for example, philosophical systems all over the world, they can be really synthesized into really three major types of worldviews. Okay, for example, there is one worldview that says, in philosophy, there's a lot of philosophical schools, particularly in the West, again, in the Western world, that it says, well, this physical world is really real, and only that which can be experienced with our senses, matter. In other words, if we can actually see it, touch it, if we can actually hear it and smell it, etc., then that's real. So that which cannot be seen, cannot be detected from our senses is not really real. Okay, so that is one school, again, of philosophy. It's called materialism. In other words, that really the natural world, there's all there is to it. We have to study it, and we have to be very much concerned with developing material systems, economies for the well-being of people, because we have to be happy in this world. Happiness is found here and the now, in this physical existence. That's one school. There's another school that says, well, yeah, this physical world is actually real, but there's also another world that is equally real as well. Okay? And that other world is really a supernatural realm. It is a spiritual world in which all spiritual matters, all spiritual entities reside. Whether you want to call it God, angels, and you name it. All kinds of supernatural entities reside there. And that school of thought actually validates that there is a material world that is very real, and we have to be concerned with it, We have to be taking care of it and so on. We have to be finding happiness here. But ultimately, there's also another spiritual world. And after we die, we go into this other world. That's another school of thought. Again, in many civilizations, this is endorsed as well. Now, there's a third philosophical school, and this is central to Indian philosophy and Indian civilization at large. And in that school of thought, the main notion is that this physical world that we're here, again, that we're experiencing with our senses, is not really real. Okay? It's an illusion. It's just like a dreamscape, in other words. That is just an illusion. It's like a dream of the soul. Ultimately, it's not really real. There's only one reality. There's only one world that is real, and that is the divine realm. Again, the spiritual, if you will, realm. That is what is real. That is the ground of being. That is the source of creation and everything within it. It comes from the spiritual world. It's permanent. It's eternal. It never changes. It has always been there. And here we're just trapped again in an illusion, in a dream, if you will. So again, that is a third philosophical school that is going to be, of course, rooted in the Indian subcontinent, and this is going to be the guiding principle of Indian society and culture for thousands and thousands of years, this divine reality, and there's a search for it. The main concern, the main preoccupation of Indian society and culture is to tap into this divine reality, try to search for it, to become one with it, again, and trying to attain what is called liberation. Liberation from this illusion, in other words, liberation from the material world that ultimately is just a dream of the spirit, in other words. It's just a dream. And we're trapped in this dream, of course, continuously. We're in a process of reincarnations. We're reincarnating over and over again within this dreamscape, if you will, because that is really the purpose of life. The purpose of life is to wake up and to attain oneness with this divine reality, in other words. So it's a very, very different concept of life, a very different concept of human existence, the universe, and it sets in motion the whole purpose of the culture. That is to say, just the way we looked at Egypt and Mesopotamia, they had their own conceptions, they were following those concepts, but here is a whole different, again, concept. So this is why we have termed this topic In Search of Divine Reality. Okay? All right, so now let us proceed with looking at Indian civilization by first gaining some very general knowledge about the geography. It is very, very important to note that Indian civilization was not confined to the territory that today constitutes the country of India. In the ancient world, this civilization encompassed a larger territorial domain, what is called the Indian subcontinent, that included regions that today are, for example, the modern day country of Pakistan, for example. Afghanistan was part of it as well, Bangladesh, and also India as well. We're talking about a 1.5 million square miles of territory. So again, the civilization that we're going to see on the rise started out, of course, in northwestern India, but over time, this civilization is going to expand culturally across all of this region that you see in this map. Okay, so once again, the main cultural features and ideas, this idea of searching for divine reality and so on, again, was the central notion of all the multiplicity of groups that inhabited this region, that there will be a multiplicity, again, of many different linguistic, ethnic groups scattered across this region. But they all, at one point, are going to share in common those ideas again as well, particularly the philosophy and the religion. Again, they're going to be the binding force, again, of the entire Indian civilization, of the entire system. Okay, so first and foremost, let's understand that this is, again, the territorial domain of Indian civilization. Okay. Now, another very important aspect of India's geography for understanding its development and their cultural features and characteristics that we're going to be looking at in this topic is that the geography really was quite diverse, can be also interpreted as a fractured geography. This is not a uniform landscape that will permit people to come together and really form, for example, as we'll see, large political states. Okay, so this is very, very important. The geography was very diverse. There are 3 major regions, although you can break those regions up into other sub-regions as well, but there are 3 major regions. The northern region will be the Himalayan mountain range. This is where the Himalayas are located in India. Let me just, get the map so you can see again that the Himalayas, again, are in the northern part of India. They tend to be the cooler part of the Indian subcontinent. And that's considered one particular region, if you will, the northern mountains, the Himalayan mountains to the north. Okay. The second region will be the river plains, the Indus and Ganges river plains, just south of the Himalayas. Let me just go back to the map. Okay, just south of the Himalayas again, we're going to see major river systems, one in the northwest, right here in this area, gigantic river system, and another one here in the northeast as well, the Ganges River. Okay, and those are fluvial areas. Now, even within this river plain, there is, of course, great diversity due to the fact, for example, that when you look at the northeast, we're going to see more rainfall, for example. The monsoons, of course, occur twice a year. One is in January, and the other one is during the summertime. And those are, again, just thunderstorms that bring a lot of rain. And they increase, of course, the volume of water of those rivers and become very, very abundant. And also the vegetation is also very, very lush and very abundant as well. Okay, so the vegetation, the fertility, the water supply tends to be more abundant, again, in the northeast, in the Ganges River. Whereas, for example, in the Indus River Valley, although there's a major river that is also very abundant with water, the terrain as a whole tends to be drier. So even though this is where the very first civilization will flourish in the northwest along the Indus River, nonetheless, It requires extensive public works and canals and irrigation, something we're going to be looking at, of course, once we go look at part one. Okay, like looking at the Indus River Valley Civilization. Now, there is yet another area of the India subcontinent in the south, and that is the southwestern region along the coastline that is really a tropical rainforest. Okay, it has wildlife, it has plenty of rainfall every year. It's a whole different geography from the rest of the India subcontinent. So there's yet another sub-region in the south, again in the western coastline, all across the western coastline. Again, so it is a very, very diverse geography. The significance of this diverse and fractured geography, as I mentioned, is that this is going to shape the size and character and nature of the political systems that will flourish across thousands of years in India. If you recall, when we're talking, for example, about Mesopotamia was really a mud flat plain. There are no barriers, no natural barriers whatsoever. So that facilitated the rise of empires, cities that were, becoming more militarized, were marching across the region rather easily into other cities, conquering them, because, again, nature posed absolutely no barriers for that. So again, this was an area that was constantly raided from time to time and invaded, and we see the rise and fall of empires. Egypt was protected by also natural barriers, that allowed for a long continuity. So the geography is very important to determine, in many cases, the kind of political systems that will flourish. So likewise, what we see here is something rather similar here, in that this fractured geography in India that was fragmented is going to lead to political fragmentation as well. The political systems are going to be very, very regional. They're going to be very limited to specific localities, and the ability for those political systems to actually expand is going to be very difficult, precisely because all of the barriers that we just talked about, the tropical rainforest, for example, of southwestern India, the plateau, for example, the hills, the desert, the mountains, the Himalayas, for instance, the river plains, and so on, they pose difficulties for actually allowing city-states to expand significantly and create large political units. So instead, we see smaller political units. They're going to be very, very small, limited to only very small geographical areas as well. Which leads to, once again, a decentralization of the political order within India. That, this idea that it's going to be easy for an empire to flourish here in this region, although they did flourish. Again, we're going to be looking at the Mauryan, for example, the Gupta and the Mughals, for example. Yes, it's true, but as I said, those empires did not really last very, very long. They were short-lived, and one of the reasons is that they were dealing with a very difficult topography and geography. So it was very difficult to send forces, to send troops out, and to control vast territories, to dispatch, forces when there were rebellions, for example. Again, and there were constant rebellions in many cases against the emperors and so on. So it's going to be very, very difficult, very, very difficult to centralize authority in the hands of a single city or a single ruler. So in many cases, the history of India is the history of decentralized states. Okay? Decentralized states. That history of decentralized states indicates that in India, the state is not going to be the major force for creating and shaping a collective identity. Okay? Unlike, for example, when we looked at, in the third topic, the rise of empires in Mesopotamia in the Near East, those empires really wanted to create a uniform cultural system. They were introducing official languages, for example, introducing cults and laws, etc., to create a common identity. So it was the state that was the major force for actually shaping identity in the Near East. Here in India, the state is not going to be that force. Instead, because of this fractured geography that fragmented the region politically and could not really allow for the centralization of states to create empires that will last a long time to create a common culture, instead, local institutions were the ones that were in charge of providing a source of identity to people. Local institutions. For example, religion is going to be such a force in India to create the identity of the peoples of India that are creating Indian civilization. Religion. Again, local cults, local religious cults are going to be the ones that are going to be providing the source of identity. Also, caste. We're going to be looking, of course, in this topic at caste. The division of Indian society into 4 different groups. And as people are born into a specific caste or group, they took on the identity of that group. If you were born into for example, the caste of warriors, well, you took on the identity of the warrior caste. If you were born into the caste of priest, you took on the identity of that caste, and so on. Again, so caste, which was really the main form of social organization in Indian society, is going to be also a source of identity for people at a very local level. And also guilds. We're going to see the creation of guilds. Those are, again, associations of people that actually perform the same task or trade, like artisans, for example, or merchants. They form guilds in order to help each other to set standards of quality and prices, etc. This is also going to be another local institution that will provide a source of identity, again, whether you were a merchant or an artisan, etc. But again, the identity is being created in India, but very much so at a local level. Now, the fact that India has significant amounts of territories that are dry and they have deserts as well, although they have, of course, certain rivers that are the major rivers like the Indus rivers and the Ganges rivers, for example. Despite that fact, this geographical feature is going to lead to the emergence of a water cult, so to speak, in which water will be deified and will be elevated as a sacred element that will come from the gods, for example, the sacredness of water. In fact, the Ganges River will be considered a goddess, as a matter of fact, a sacred river. And the idea was that people needed to bathe in this river as a cleansing ritual or cleansing mechanism, at least once in a lifetime, if not more, as part of this purification process. And it will be visited by millions of people, and there will be temples built all over, again, on the banks of the river, across, again, territories, again, where the river was actually, passing through. So once again, this is a very, very important feature, again, of Indian geography that is going to shape, in many cases, the religious ideas, the religious cults, and it's going to really provide a source of identity as well. Okay. All right. So now let's move into part one. And part one, as I mentioned, is going to deal with the very first historical period of Indian civilization. And this is really the formative period. And that is when the very first civilization flourished in the Indian subcontinent. Is going to be termed the Indus River Civilization. We don't know how the people that lived and created this civilization call themselves, but scholars simply call this civilization the Indus River Civilization because, again, it was really, again, a civilization that flourished along the Indus River. And the very early origins of this civilization date back to 3000 BC. Again, so that corresponds with the rise of Egyptian civilization and also Sumerian civilization. Again, we see simultaneously in different parts of the world people moving into the river and creating the very first irrigation systems and cities. This is the same process again. So we're dealing with a river civilization as well. And this river civilization spanned from 3000 to 1500 BC. It is very important to note that the Indus River civilization constituted a region that encompassed what today is northwestern India, or as well present-day Pakistan and present-day Afghanistan. During this very early time period, this region constituted a single cultural domain. Okay? And this is where the Indus River civilization actually flourished. Once again, it was the Indus River. Again, it descends from mountains as well. And people by 3000 are now arriving to the river, just like in Egypt, just like we saw in Mesopotamia, and they're beginning to develop an agricultural revolution as well. Okay? And this is going to lead to the rise of cities and, of course, an entire civilization that spanned for about 1500 years. So, once again, this is a river civilization, which means that there is a technological revolution taking place here. What is called hydraulic engineering. Okay? There are, of course, projects, massive public works projects in which people are diverting water from the Indus River in order to create, of course, large-scale agriculture. So it's a hydraulic culture. Okay, the Indus River Valley, just like the one in Egypt and Mesopotamia. And we're going to see that, of course, in China as well. It is a hydraulic culture because it was not just a matter of developing irrigation systems and canal works to water their crops, but in many cases, the cities that they built had running water as well and drainage. So they were really mastering the craft of using water, diverting it, and being able to supply their cities and every household with running water. So it was an amazing, an astonishing accomplishment of engineering. And drainage as well. They were draining, of course, water from the cities and the sewage as well. They have drainage systems. So it was, technologically speaking, very advanced considering the times that we're looking at here in the ancient world. Now, the population was composed of a group of people that shared a common language. It's called the Dravidian language, Proto-Dravidian language. Okay? So, over time, of course, those groups are going to break apart, and there will be about 4 languages that will stem from the Proto-Dravidian, the original Proto-Dravidian language. There will be about 4 languages that still survive today in southern India. Not necessarily here in northwestern India. Well, they're called the Proto-Dravidian peoples. It is an ethno-linguistic group that share a common language, and they're the group that actually created the very first civilization of the Indian subcontinent. And in this process of building their waterworks and undergoing the very first agricultural revolution of this region, they built about 1,500 settlements. 1,500 settlements across this region along the banks of the river. Some settlements, of course, were villages, small communities, while other settlements were towns and also large cities, or city-states. Each city was autonomous, independent, self-run, and so there's no indication, at least from the records that we have that are based on archaeological remains. There are, of course, there's archaeological remains of ancient cities that archaeologists began studying around the beginning of the 20th century. The main ones that we're getting most of the information from about the Indus River Valley Civilization comes from the city-states of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. Okay? Were they the only city-states? No. But once again, those are the remains of that civilization that inform us about their urban setting and development. For example, the hydraulic systems that they used, the architectural tools and technologies and the like, and of course the size of the populations. It is estimated that those were really large urban centers that housed about 30 to maybe 40,000 people each city. And considering, again, that they're flourishing about 3000 BC, this is an astonishing as well accomplishment as well. How people are able to sustain such large populations in an urban environment. Okay, so Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa are the the cities that we are studying, and this is where we actually gain some insights about their developments. This is again a photograph precisely of Harappa, for example. It has been unearthed by archaeologists, it has been excavated, and now there is significant knowledge that we have about their urban planning and works. We're going to get to see that section in just a few seconds. But what's significant is that the city of Harappa had very well developed hydraulic systems, as I said, drainage, for example, and running water and the like. And also, it had a central pool in the very middle of the city. It's considered to be a pool, but when you look at it very closely, it is really positioned on top of a mound, and it's supposed to be a ceremonial actual center that was used for religious purposes. Once again, we see the use of water for religious purposes, how water is being elevated as a sacred element is It's a religious, has a religious significance. And what we conclude from the central pool that is positioned here in the very center of Harappa is that it was used as a ritual bath for purification purposes, where people will go in and take a ceremonial bath and use the water to cleanse themselves. In other words, spiritually, that is to say. Okay, so it was used for rituals and ceremonies. Mohenjo-Daro, that's another Indus River Valley city-state, which means Mount of the Dead, was another city that also housed 40,000 people at one time. Those cities, both Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, were very well organized, and the architecture reveals that there was very careful planning as well in the engineering, in the design of the houses, for example, and the layout. It was extremely, again, very, very well organized and thought of. It was not just, again, a settlement that people built in an improvised fashion, but rather there were engineers, of course, at work here. What we know about those city-states and all the other city-states of the region is that they were densely populated. Okay, as I mentioned, there were tens of thousands of people living in those urban centers. There was careful and well-planned, of course, engineering at work. And there was also standardization in the engineering work as well. For example, we have now very clear evidence that the housing blocks, the blocks that were used, for example, to build the houses, were all uniform. They were really the same size. In all of the cities, it's not just one city, but across all of this region. As people are beginning to build their houses, for example, they're using blocks that are exactly the same size. And whenever they were building for example, the administrative buildings, they used blocks that were different in size, they were larger, but they were also uniform, of the same size as well. So smaller bricks or blocks for houses and larger blocks, again, for public buildings. And this is across the region. So there was uniformity, that is to say. This is uniformity. So it was very well planned. It was standardized, and uniformity, again, in their construction works. Also, what we know is that the layout of the cities, the way that they were built, is that they were positioned and oriented according to the four cardinal directions. You have, for example, east and west, and that is really the movement of the sun. The sun rises in the east, sets in the west. And you have, of course, a north and south direction. So those are the four cardinal directions. East and west, according to the movement of the sun, and of course, the north and south. And all of the cities were really built to correspond to the four cardinal directions, in which the grid of the streets, for example, and the blocks and the houses were all aligned according to the four cardinal directions. Again, there was a grid system, in other words. So very, very well organized, very well thought of. A marvel of engineering, and of course also a marvel of astronomy. As I mentioned, there were public baths in almost all of those cities, and there's an indication that those were used for ceremonial purposes. So we see here a water cult very early on, perhaps because water was valued for its uses in agriculture, That was the source of all the food and the crops that sustained the people. But also keep in mind that in the northwest part of India, in this geographical area, the terrain, the topography tends to be also quite dry as well. So people valued also water in a region that was kind of dry as well. So this is really the source of life in general, not only for the crops, but also for animals, for people in general, for human societies, for the entire civilization. And so people develop a certain ritual, if you will, complex to water, and they started bathing in a very ceremonial way in the very center of each city. So this is another feature. Again, that there are public bathing pools as well. We also know from archaeological records that there was certain connections that were built between the Indus River Valley Civilization and Mesopotamia, ancient Sumer, for example. There were trading networks, that is to say, and of course, there had been many different kinds of artworks that were created in Mesopotamia that have been found here in this region, in those cities. So once again, artwork and tools that were crafted in Mesopotamia were found in northwestern India, and likewise there are writings, clay tablets in Mesopotamia in which there's indication that the rulers were also importing certain products also from the Indus River Valley Civilization and certain animals as well. There are writings, again, there's actual historical records of that. Now, the Indus River Valley Civilization, those city-states, produced a writing system. It seems to be also uniform. It was used across many cities as well. It was composed of about 400 symbols, but unfortunately, those 400 symbols have not yet been deciphered. Okay? We do not know exactly what they say. In many cases, they use pictures, they use signs, but we don't know what they actually mean. So there's plenty of archaeological remains for us to rebuild or reconstruct their own society and culture, but unfortunately, there's not really enough writing records that inform us about, for example, their political systems, about their religious hierarchies, if they had religious hierarchies, for example. We just don't know. We don't know how the society was organized, what kind of groupings existed, how that society was divided. Again, we just don't know, just because there's not enough information available to us from their writing records. However, the writing system, the little that we know based on, for example, the pictures, the emblems that are left to us, there's really no indication that warfare was central to this society. Again, so even though we cannot read those symbols, I mean, there is really no signs of warfare. For example, this is very, very evident in Mesopotamia. You can see in those clay tablets, how warfare was glorified, how kings perform military functions and conquests, and there is, of course, evidence, and there's also evidence in Egypt of that in the New Kingdom. But here we just don't know, again, if they carried out warfare, or there's any clues or indication from their symbols that they actually carried out those activities. There's no indication that they were governed by kings, or if they had actual palaces, for example, that were built for their kings and so on, like royal palaces, etc. So again, there's no pictures of that, and this is very common. if they actually had monarchies and they had, royal palaces and they conducted war, that would have been indicated in those symbols, again, that this was a major concern, a major activity that they carried out, etc. So we assume that this was a very peaceful society and that they had no centralized authority. There was no real, again, monarchy that was governing the entire area, and that there were actual hierarchies, again, dividing society from top to bottom. There's no indication of that. There is, however, some indication that this society, very, very early on, was already devoted to spirituality, to the quest, to the search for this divine reality, that is to say. And this is one of those pictures that are left to us from those writings, in which you can see a yogi, somebody actually sitting in a yogic position with the crossed legs, again, and meditating, with the arms extended, over the on top of the legs. Again, so yoga is very ancient. So this is for sure, again, that this society had that kind of orientation. They had no orientation for warfare, no orientation for, monarchical systems and the like, but there was an orientation towards, again, spirituality and the divine reality. Okay. So this is, again, just a clue. Now, in terms of social organization, what we do know from their social organization, and this is something that we learn from the nomadic groups that migrated about 1500 BC, the Aryans, we're going to get to see, of course, in part 2, the Vedic age, when the Indo-Europeans, the Aryans, are arriving, of course, to India. What we know from the Aryans that came into contact with the last survivors or heirs of the Indus River Valley Civilization, the Dravidians, is that the natives of India that lived in this region had a very different social organization from the Indo-European, in that here in this society, the mother was the one in charge of the family, and it was also in charge of the society as well. They had a matriarchal society. It was a matriarchy. A matriarchy is ruled by the mother. The mother is the one in charge, once again, of the family, and is the one in charge also of making the most important decisions of society at the community level. And people followed the line of the family in terms of leadership, in terms of access to resources. This is what is called matrilineal. People are, again, inheriting wealth, they're inheriting their political status and their last name from the mother's side of the family, not the father's side. So this is a very, very important distinction, that this was, again, a matriarchal society. And so it is also assumed that such societies were also oriented towards the female side of divinity, which means that they worship the goddess as well. Okay? As a matter of fact, as we'll see, for example, the river Ganges is going to be considered a goddess. So there is a certain devotion to the earth goddess. When people pray, for example, to divinity, they pray to the goddess, to the earth mother, and so on. And this is also, again, reflected in the social organization. The mother is the one in charge as well. So again, this is a matriarchal society. This is what we know about the Indus River Valley Civilization. Of course, there's going to be a shift towards a patriarchal society once we see the arrival of the Indo-Europeans, the Aryans, that are beginning to arrive about 17 to 1500 BC, thereabout. They're beginning to arrive to northwest India. And they brought patriarchy. The father is now in charge. So there's going to be a shift to a more male-dominated society with the arrival of the Aryans. Now, the Indus River Valley Civilization, which flourished about 3000 BC, is going to enter into a decline, so to speak, between the centuries, the 1900s, all the way to the 1500s BC. In those 4 centuries, we're going to see a gradual decline, eventually a collapse of that civilization, when slowly but surely, one by one, each one of those cities was abandoned. You can see the decline in the architectural record with poor construction, for example, of housings, for example, and drainage. They're not going to be of the same quality. You can see that people are losing knowledge, or they're not very careful at building their waterworks, for example, as well. The cities seem rather deteriorated as well during this period of time. People are not really refurnishing, rebuilding their homes, and there is, of course, a certain decay taking place. Although people still live there, there is, of course, the lack of resources, perhaps even the lack of will to actually repair those houses. And of course, we see gradually, slowly but surely, people abandoning those urban centers, and they're becoming more and more dispersed, and they're moving into the outside, and they're now living again in small nested communities and villages, again outside of those cities. By 1500, those cities had become totally abandoned. Now, this was a major collapse of the Indus River Valley Civilization. That doesn't mean that that civilization collapsed altogether. We're going to see a resurgence, of course, when the Indo-Europeans, the Aryans, arrived. They're going to continue Indian civilization, and they're going to merge, so to speak, with the population, the native indigenous population of India, and they're going to continue Indian civilization in a new way. Again, we're going to see the rise, of course, in part 2 of another historical period known as the Vedic Age, and this is going to be a resurgence, so to speak, of Indian civilization. So it didn't die, but the cities are abandoned. The cities are indeed abandoned by 1500. Now, the reasons for this, again, scientists, academics are trying to understand the causes for this. It's not very clear. There's been several theories that propose, explanations for this. One is the theory of, for example, environmental change. Okay, that the environment changed. The rivers dried up, for example. That's one explanation. During that period of time, they're not as abundant, for example. There's a lack of rain, perhaps some prolonged droughts that perhaps caused the abandonment. Of course, there's no water available, not in the same amount. This is not going to be possible to sustain those large urban centers. So again, that kind of makes sense. The other is that intensive agriculture. Now, when people are growing crops year after year for hundreds and hundreds of years, they're going to, in many cases, exhaust the soil, or perhaps the other explanation is that the water that was available to them by the Indus River carried more salt during that time, and the salt actually ruined the fields, and people actually began to abandon those cities. So those are, again, those are environmental causes. The other explanation is invasions. That because the Indo-Europeans began arriving slowly but surely around 2000 BC in small numbers, they entered this region, and then those migrations began intensifying around 1700 BC, and even more so by 1500 BC. This other interpretation proposes that instead of the environmental change, which perhaps was one of the causes of the gradual abandonment of those settlements, that perhaps what we're looking at here is that the Aryans, the Indo-Europeans that are beginning to arrive into this region, began to raid and invade those cities and force people to leave and abandon those urban centers. So this is, again, a theory that deals more with an outright invasion, that is to say. And there was a displacement of populations, and the Aryans are taking over this region, pushing the Dravidian population out of this region, pushing them south, and taking over the region. That is also a theory. There's no real, again, evidence that points out conclusively that this was so, although perhaps there was warfare, perhaps occasionally there were invasions, raids, and the like. There's no clear indication that there was an apocalyptic takeover or invasion by the Aryans over India, and that they destroyed the cities and took over them, etc. There's no indication of that, again. So, again, those are just hypotheses, assumptions, theories about why is it that this civilization that was really very well organized, you can see that in the layout of the cities, their hydraulic systems, the drainage, for example, the waterworks, the orientation of the cities, etc. The standardization of the building blocks of the houses, and the public buildings and the like. Obviously, they were very, very sophisticated technologically, and also their scientific mathematical systems, their tools were also very sophisticated as well. So why is it that they entered such decline? Again, still very uncertain. We don't know. What we do know is that although those cities are abandoned, Indian civilization is not really coming to an end here. It's simply entering another stage of development. And this is, again, the stage of development that we're going to get to see in part 2, and that is that we're going to see the arrival of another group, again, the Aryans, as I mentioned. They're beginning to arrive around 2000 BC. Remember, this is the group that actually came out of the Caucasus Mountains initially. Some of them moved into Asia Minor, the Hittites, other into modern-day Iran, what is called Persia, and yet others started migrating still to the east until they entered northwestern India. And they're going to really create another expression of Indian civilization, very unique. And as a matter of fact, as we'll see, they're going to shape Indian civilization to the point that they will actually create its classical form, its classical expression, starting around more or less around 700 BC onwards. The Aryans, so to speak, are going to initiate what is called the Vedic age of India. And this is going to be yet another historical period that we're going to examine rather closely in the second session. We're going to get to see the arrival of the Aryans, their settlements in India, how they interacted with the indigenous societies of the Indian subcontinent, the Dravidians, for example, how they reorganized that society altogether, and how they're going to introduce new religious ideas and philosophical ideas that are going to give India its unique expression. Okay, so this is all I have for you. This is the end of session 1. I'll see you then in session 2 to continue looking at part 2. Thank you.